Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to the Sanctuary. I'm your host, Professor C, and we're going to do some more A&P today. Specifically, we're going to do round 2 into the nervous system and check out the neuroglial cells. So, let's do it. Okay, so last time we dealt with these neurons, and we mentioned that there's another type of nervous cell that's very important that's not a neuron, and we collectively refer to these as neuroglia. Or sometimes they're called gliacytes, even though it's kind of an old-fashioned term. Now, depending on where you are in the nervous system, you can see different types of these neuroglia. So, astrocytes, microglia, ependymal, sometimes pronounced ependymal cells, TANYCYTES, and oligodendrocytes. These will all be specifically found in the CNS, that is the central nervous system, that is the brain and the spinal cord. If you get outside or beyond the brain and spinal cord, you may see cells like SCHWANN cells or satellite cells, but you again would only find these in the peripheral nervous system, the PNS. So let's take a look at some of the structure function of these glial cells. So let's start here with the astrocytes first. Now the name roughly translates to astrostar-cyte cell, roughly a star cell. And based on the images here you see, it does kind of look like a star, but a lot of the neural tissue has these multiple branched cell structures. So just knowing that, hey, it's a star-shaped cell doesn't quite do it. But right here, and I'm going to circle this, blood vessel. If you see a blood vessel in the image, you're probably looking at an astrocyte, especially if it's reaching its feet or arms out and grabbing the blood vessel. So these are the most abundant type of glial cell. Not only does it do some sort of support, but more importantly, you see those arms again grabbing down to that very tiny blood vessel known as a capillary. So they will help determine blood flow or capillary permeability between the tissues. They also will kind of act like a shepherd, and they'll guide the migration of young neurons and try to help them figure out where to go in the neural network. Alright, moving to microglia, as the name suggests, these are small glial cells. It's a little kind of pinkish, tannish colored ones here. The blue cells would be neurons. So these are quite small when you compare them to the size of a neuron, and they are very simply going to act very much like a white blood cell would, especially a phagocytic type of white blood cell. So these are small cells that walk around the neural tissue, and if they encounter microorganisms or neuronal debris, they will phagocytize it, that is, they will pull it into their cell body and destroy or recycle that material. Ependymal cells, again, can be pronounced ependymal. Out here in this big white space, I've left it very large so you can see here. This is CSF. This would be called cerebrospinal fluid, and it's probably in this image inside of a ventricle of the brain, and we'll get into those specifics much later. But this row of cells here, this pink row of cells with these cilia sticking out into the CSF, and the neural tissue is underneath down here where I'm putting this X, that is the rest of the neural tissue. So in between this boundary between the neural tissue and the cerebrospinal fluid, we will find these ependymal cells. And I always thought that ependymal was referred to something like a jacket, like it was a jacket coating the neural tissue. So they are specialized epithelial cells, and they are going to line these cavities like the ventricles of the brain and the central canal of the spinal cord. Ultimately, their job is to separate the interstitial fluid of the nervous tissue from the cerebrospinal fluid, just like this picture is showing. Now, TANYCYTES are kind of cousins to the ependymal cells. They very much look like ependymal or ependymal cells, and they have similar functions. So we are going to find these in the brain, and we find these associated especially with the third and the fourth ventricles of the brain. And we find these cells especially where we find association with the hypothalamus, a part of the brain we'll talk about a lot because it has a lot of long-reaching functions in the body. So, using this what's called a hypophyseal portal system, and that would involve not only the hypothalamus but also the pituitary gland. If you can remember back a long time ago, we talked about the pituitary gland sometimes can be called the hypophysis, so the word hypophyseal would refer to the pituitary. So what's going to happen with these TANYCYTES is they're going to have some sort of connection to the CSF and to the blood supply in the central nervous system. And this will allow some communication, chemical signaling in between these two regions. So if these TANYCYTES have something to do with talking, if you will, communicating with the CSF and the central nervous system's blood supply, you can argue that, hey, maybe this has to do with a lot of endocrine events that are also associated with the hypothalamus and the pituitary portal system. So we should hear about these later on when we get back to some of the endocrine talks further down the course. Our last stop here in the CNS glia are the oligodendrocytes. Say it with me, oligodendrocytes. Oligo referring to few, denders, the thing we've seen before, meaning branches or tree branches, and cytes is cells. So these would be cells that have relatively few branches. Now if you look at the picture there, it looks like an old astrocyte we just saw, except it's colored blue here. Notice the X's here that I'm putting on the image. It looks like those arms of this oligodendrocyte, where I'll put this kind of circular O there, is reaching down to a blood vessel, like we saw the astrocytes doing. But that is actually reaching down to an axon of a neuron, and it's wrapping a lipid layer around the axon. So we've talked about this in the last talk, this concept of the myelin sheath. So oligodendrocytes are cells that wrap around CNS nerve axons, not all of them, but we would only find these in the CNS. And if you've ever been told, you know, once you break part of your brain or break part of your spinal cord, it's very hard to fix this, to repair it. Sometimes it's irreparable damage if you damage it in a certain way. Mainly because of this, oligodendrocytes have growth inhibiting proteins that stop the regenerative process from happening. Now in the PNS, we'll have a different set of rules here. Oligodendrocytes will not be there, so we will have a little bit of regenerative ability. So oligodendrocytes are all about myelinating CNS nerve axons. All right, this is a really nice little cartoony looking overview, but if I can point right here to these cells, I can say, well, this is probably CSF and some kind of a ventricle. And so these cells here with the cilia that are poking out here, those are probably the ependymal cells. You could see their cousins, the TANYCYTES. If you could see them, you'd probably see their arms reaching out toward the blood vessel and reaching out toward other cells as well, so we can do that communication. But I don't see any TANYCYTES in this picture. Here though, I'll put an arrow, follow me here, to this green cell. I'll put a big A on it. That's an astrocyte, and I know that because look at its feet reaching down and grabbing on to that capillary right there. There's another astrocyte on the left-hand side of the screen where I'm putting this A on this green cell, reaching over to the capillary as well. Now this yellow cell here that I'm putting a big N on, that's just a plain old neuron. I'll put another N on this cell here to show you that's another neuron, just a plain old neuron like we saw in the last lecture. You can follow its axons down here, and you can follow this one's axon down this way, and you'll notice the blue wrapping around it. So these must be myelin sheaths, where I'm putting this little red dash here, and this that I'm circling must be an oligodendrocyte that is allowing myelination of those central nervous axons. Now if I can clear out my screen a little bit, and I can circle this kind of maroon colored cell here. There's another one right down here at the bottom of the screen. These would be the microglia. And the microglia, of course, are the ones that wander around and phagocytize microbes and other types of debris that has accumulated in the nervous tissue. All right, now we're moving into the peripheral glia. So everything we've done before this was all central nervous system glia. Now we're into the peripheral glia because I see the SCHWANN cell. And what you can do is look right down here at this blue thing, and that is an axon, and you're looking kind of like down the length of the wire. You don't see the whole wire, you just see the opening of it. And you see this cell wrapping around that wire, and it keeps on wrapping around and wrapping around and wrapping around, and it's forming a myelin sheath. You say, well, I just saw an oligodendrocyte forming a myelin sheath. Well, this is a SCHWANN cell in the PNS forming myelin sheaths, a different type of cell for a different location. Now these do have regenerative power. They do have the ability to regenerate, although not very quickly and not perfectly. But if you do damage a peripheral nervous fiber, you do have a higher chance of regeneration because this myelination is done with SCHWANN cells and not with oligodendrocytes, which are not regenerative. Our final stop here is the satellite cell, and it's these little purple guys that are kind of wrapping around the cell body of this unipolar neuron. So these are doing exactly what I just said. We only find these in the peripheral systems, and they're wrapping around a body. You might think, well, what are they doing? Well, they're going to be cushioning and protecting that cell body from damage. Sometimes there are so many satellite cells around that body that it will completely envelop the entire soma, or the entire body of the cell. All right, I hope you enjoyed that talk on neuroglia. Thanks for watching it to the end if you did. Check out some more videos in the series if you want to learn about more A and P. See you for the next one. Bye-bye.